Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. I'm Jamie Machik with the Nicolet Federated Library System, and on behalf of myself and the 14 other systems in Wisconsin who helped sponsor this event, we are glad you're here. And we're glad whether you are in Wisconsin or in, we've had some people from Nebraska, Virginia, South Dakota, and that's great. It's awesome. We have people listening in from all over. We had 5 sessions yesterday. We have 5 today on a variety of topics. Just had a presentation by Pat Wagner, and our next presenter is Roy Tennant of OCLC Research. And Roy was highly recommended as someone to talk about tech trends by Sarah Houghton. She spoke yesterday. And I think this is one of those topics that can be done often because, as we all know, technology is changing rapidly. It's changing all the time, especially in libraries. So I'm really pleased that Roy is here to talk with us about tech trends. So, Roy, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks, Jamie, and thank you to everyone for taking time out of your busy day to be here with me. I did want to mention that today I'm not really going to focus on specific technologies so much as I am general and specific concepts, because I think that's what's going to really be most important for you to know about and to keep in mind, because any specific technology, as we've seen, will come and go. So it's really the lessons we can learn from how technology changes and how it changes society and where and how we work. That is really what's important. I use this particular slideshow background on purpose because, not just because I enjoy skiing, not downhill so much as cross country, but I've often talked about dealing with technology like riding shotgun down an avalanche, where things are changing extremely rapidly, and you're just trying to basically keep your head above the snow. So that's kind of why I've used this background. Questions are welcome at any time, but I will hold off on answering them until the end. But please feel free to drop them in to the question window as we go along so you don't forget, and then we'll circle back around and get to those at the end. So with that, I wanted to begin with just a quick little history of where we've come in the last few decades in library technology, because I think it can be instructive, and we'll get around to how I think that's instructive at the end. I also have occasionally called myself the Forrest Gump of library technology, because like Forrest Gump, who ended up experiencing pretty much every major thing that happened at the end of the last century so much, I've pretty much experienced every major piece of library technology over the last 30 years. So this begins with Library Hand, which is probably the first library technology, at least the first one that I was aware of. I volunteered at a public library in Indiana where we still had cards that were written in Library Hand, which was a very specific style of cursive writing that was believed to be very readable. And that, of course, was eventually replaced by this thing, first the manual and then the electric typewriter. And this baby here got me through college in the early and mid-'80s. And we would use this to type up type up cards for the catalog. And this came along in kind of the late 70s, early 80s. This was the computer that I programmed my very first program on in BASIC in the early 80s. And in fact, my very first program, I'm proud to say, was a library orientation program where someone would come up to this and it would ask them questions and tell them things about the library. This came along, let's see, this was probably in the mid-'80s. PDP 1170 is a mini computer. Many early library automation systems ran on machines like this. I actually worked on a PDP 1170 for Humboldt State Library in the early to mid-'80s, where we were installing a CLSI circulation system. That was the very first automated system that library had seen. And although it was designed simply as a circulation system, it didn't take us long before we put terminals out in front of users so they could look things up. So that was kind of the nascent library catalog, if you will. This came along, of course, in 1984, and this is breakthrough in the sense that it put a graphical user interface in the hands of a regular person. So that was like our first introduction of graphical user interfaces. I remember working on one of these in the very early days when it came out at Humboldt State, and then also eventually at UC Berkeley a little bit later. And we used this to do things like create flyers and do desktop publishing. For quite a while, desktop publishing was quite the revolution because we could do that ourselves. We could make our own flyers. We didn't have to go to a special service unit to do that. This, of course, was a time of the acoustic coupler modem. We used this to get online, and online at that time was kind of the nascent internet. Internet bulletin boards, Usenet news groups. We would connect directly with Dialog to do online searching, which is quite painful at the speed of 300 bits per second, where you just see a letter appear and another one, and it just was extremely slow and excruciating. But it was also a breakthrough technology at that point because we could get online and do those kinds of things for our users. I mentioned Usenet news groups. These were the days of the green screens, still here in the 1980s. But again, they were revolutionary for their time because we were connected to the broader world. Of course, Windows version 3.1 came along, and that was the first really usable version of Windows. So then pretty much everyone had a graphical user interface environment. And that really then led the way for this, which was truly revolutionary. This is, of course, the first graphical web browser, which came out in the summer of 1993. And this was what truly put the web on everyone's radar. Before this, it was pretty much, again, kind of a green screen text interface, so it was really hard to get how revolutionary the web would be until NCSA Mosaic came along. And one of the points I want to make about this is that all of what we just went through, all of it happened in 15 years. And if you can just imagine going from an electric typewriter all the way through to the graphical web in a 15-year period was simply astonishing. And, one of the things I want to say about this is that that was an extremely compact set of changes. It probably may not even occur again. But that 15 years was truly astonishing. So let's take a look at what happened in the succeeding 20 years. So from 1993 to 2013. Basically this, and I don't mean that it's small, but there weren't a lot of really revolutionary changes in the next 20 years. The smartphone, I think, is arguably the biggest technology that's happened in the last 20 years, and this is because it has put the internet in the hands, literally in the hands of so many people just at their fingertips. When you think about it, that phone that person is holding has more computing power and storage than mainframes I was working on back in the 1980s, in the early 1980s. So the amount of computing power now at our beck and call is truly astonishing. But I would also say that, that's probably the most revolutionary thing that's happened in the last 20 years. So what can we learn from this history we just ran through fairly quickly here? One thing is that technology advances very irregularly. We have this concept, I think, that progress is fairly stable. It always goes forward, when in fact it has fits and starts. You might have that 15-year period where so much innovation happens and then hit a plateau. And I've even written about this recently that, I think we're in what I've called the Great Plateau. That is, there are changes, there are interesting things happening, but there are very few that are truly revolutionary. Whereas there can be periods when, things are just flying and we have to adapt to those kinds of things. So if you look at, kind of the timeline such as this one, you look at the last 20 years of the last century, and it's just really amazing what happened in those years. Another thing is that the consequences of technology are very difficult to predict. We might imagine that certain things will occur when something happens, but we really don't know. And some examples of that, well, who predicted Google? Who predicted that, this company would be created, which really was just around searching, and would become one of the largest companies in the world, and do this, relatively overnight. I think that was very difficult to predict. Something that I personally know is very difficult to predict was the Google Books library project. And it's kind of funny, and I debated someone a good while ago that the Library of Congress would never be fully online because of the cost and the expense and the trouble and all of that. Well, I was proven wrong not all that long after that because of Google. Because Google decided to invest in digitizing large libraries all over the world. So that I found to be extremely difficult to predict. In fact, I did not predict it at all. Also, I thought it was interesting to take a look at the market capitalization of the largest companies in the world. So I took a look at that, and of course, Apple, largest corporation out there, Google, Microsoft. Look at how many technology companies are in just the top 5. So Microsoft, of course, is the oldest, but Apple and Google are, especially Google, are relatively recent. Facebook is down there a bit lower. So we see that these companies can come along that have really garnered a great deal of capital in a very short period of time. Another lesson is the present really isn't always a good predictor of the future. And the problem is we kind of imagine that it is. And we look around, whenever we try to predict the future, we look around, which is natural, but we look around at the present to see where things stand, and then we try to extrapolate those things out. But that doesn't always work too well. So, for example, where's my jetpack? It was predicted a good long time ago that we'd all be going around in jetpacks, all over. Well, that just flat out didn't happen. It's still, it's not a technology that has come along. So, predictions can be very, very difficult to make accurately. Also, technologies build on each other, and of course, I think, we're fully aware of this, but it bears repeating that for certain things to happen, certain other things need to happen first. So, we kind of need to go through the microcomputer era to eventually get to the smartphone. And that's because, of course, in microcomputers, you're always trying to miniaturize at the same time that you're adding capacity and power and all of that. So the smartphone really is kind of the pinnacle of that at this moment, where we have miniaturized the components so much and yet added so much to its power that it can really do a lot of things on our behalf. Another thing is that true technical revolutions are personally empowering. That is, they make individuals more capable, more empowered, more able to do things. And we see this time and time again. Probably one of the most empowering revolutions there has been in recent times has been the automobile. So, think of the freedom that we now have to just, we don't have to feed the horses. We don't have to clean up after them. We don't have to, tie them up to the cart anymore. We just, something sits out in the garage and we go out and we go. This then has actually transformed our landscapes in a lot of ways that I think we don't always remember. So, truly transformative revolutions really are personally empowering. And we see this still again in the smartphone because this is a very empowering device, and it's really changing the way that we're interacting with the world around us. So those are just some things to keep in mind then about technology in general there is difficult to predict. It advances in fits and starts. The truly revolutionary revolutions, technical revolutions, are personally empowering. All those things are things worth thinking about or keeping in the back of your mind as you think about library technology. Now, there are some things that are specifically different about libraries and how libraries implement technology and the effect that technology can have on libraries. So let's take a look at some of those. Well, one major one is that most of us work in a public organization of one kind or another. We work in a public library, we work in a public academic library, and so we are then bound by the various conventions of those public institutions, and one of those is job security. So it is usually extremely difficult to fire staff. And in fact, in many organizations I have worked in, it's basically impossible. If someone isn't standing over a dead body with a smoking gun, you can't get rid of them, basically. So this has a real impact on implementing technology, as you can imagine. If you have staff who are unable and or unwilling to learn new technologies, then you're in trouble. And we've seen this happen, and this is always an ongoing struggle. So the thing is, we have to acknowledge the fact that libraries are often not going to be able to implement new technologies, as easily as private industry. And that's just really kind of a fact of life. Of course, we don't always have the money we need to implement technology completely or well, and we don't. It can be very difficult for us to increase those resources. We often have to go out to, pass a bond measure or, do some things which really have very long timelines in order to garner us any additional resources. Whereas in private industry, it's possible you might be able to just raise your price a little bit to get additional resources. Or again, you could shed staff and have more resources to invest in technology. So this also has an effect then on our ability in libraries to implement technology. And I also want to acknowledge that we do have an aging workforce, especially in libraries. I know there's a cohort that's slightly older than I am who are now kind of in retirement age. And I don't mean to be ageist and say the old people cannot learn new things. I learn new things all the time. But I have to say that there is a tendency when you're approaching retirement to not necessarily want to, put the work in to learn new things, to learn new technologies, to do what you need to do to implement technology well, because you may be retired in a few years. So why go through all that? So that can be an effect as well. We also have a bunch of what I would call special requirements in the library world, which affects our ability to use various technologies. One is that we've got this very specialized metadata format called MARC that we are the only ones who use this. So everyone else who works with books uses Onyx rather than MARC. So Amazon, publishers who work with Amazon, they use Onyx rather than MARC. So all of their infrastructure then is geared towards that, and it's only libraries really that use MARC. We also have fairly specialized workflows. That is, the kinds of onboarding activities we do to put a book on the shelf and to circulate that book and so forth is really fairly specialized. It's only libraries who do these kinds of things. So, these factors then mean that many of our technologies are basically just limited to the library world, and so the amount of investment that you put into developing those technologies, the amount of profit that can be made from selling those, it's all very limited. And so we're kind of a balkanized economy, if you will, that we are kind of off to the side, off to ourselves, and we're not part of the mainstream of technology development. of course, we often have other kinds of constrained conditions. So, for example, I mentioned the fact that we're public, that many of our organizations are public, and that can often mean that we are constrained in certain ways of dealing, buying things. We may be limited to certain suppliers for certain things. We often have a cumbersome process like, an RFQ or RFP process we have to go through, or, request for proposals where we have to create this huge document that outlines the kind of system we want and then put that out for response. So that can really slow things down, and that also means that libraries can be very reluctant to do major changes in technology. So we see that if a library implements a particular automated system, they'll almost assuredly be on that system for at least a decade, if not, a couple decades before they even, think of moving on to another one. So this, of course, has a very slowing effect on the ability of libraries to implement technology. Also, I've run into this myself personally, that especially in academic libraries, large academic libraries which have a large number of professional staff, the very collegial nature of those institutions makes it difficult to move fast. So, in other words, if there are a number of librarians who don't wish to adopt the technology, they can put the brakes on it. And I saw this in the implementation of the web at UC Berkeley, where we had a process that we had been involved in for at least the preceding year to implement the web at UC Berkeley, and a bunch of librarians stood up and said, oh, no, we can't do this. And administration was ready to delay it another year, and I finally got them to agree to 6 months. But it was, kind of an eye-opener to me to realize that, librarians who were reluctant could just completely put the brakes on the implementation of technology. So these are just a few of the kind of what I would call the special requirements of libraries in terms of technology that I think we have to keep in mind. There's a couple of charts that I want to share with you that I found very helpful in thinking about technology, and one, of course, is the Gartner Hype Cycle, which many of you may have already seen. And what this tries to do is try to map various technologies onto this chart, because typically, and this pretty much holds, I would say, for most technologies. They go through a process here over time where there's this, the technology is introduced, what they call the technology trigger. Then people start looking at it and they go, oh my God, this is so amazing. This is going to solve all my problems. And so it has this peak of inflated expectations where you expect the technology to just be, the bee's knees, to just be so awesome. And then, you start working with it and you realize, well, there's some issues and there's some problems, and you go into what's called the trough of disillusionment, where you realize, hey, it's not going to solve all your problems. It's not the be-all and end-all. And then coming out of that, there is what they call the slope of enlightenment, which leads to the plateau of productivity, which is where, we should have been probably in the beginning, but it's so hard to look at technology in such a critical way when it just comes along that we go through this process. So what Gartner does is it will take a look at specific technologies and chart them on this path as to where they are. And that can be very useful to get a sense of where we are as a society in terms of viewing certain technologies and implementing and using them. There's also this chart here, which I think is very useful, the categories of innovativeness from E.M. Rogers. And this bell curve here identifies various cohorts of technology implementers, starting with the innovators who are there on the bleeding edge, and they call it the bleeding edge for a reason. And that's because, of course, in the early days of the technology, it can be painful, and there can be problems that you have to work through, and you may not know exactly how to work with the new technology, so you're learning a lot. That leads into the early adopter stage, where it's a little bit past the bleeding edge, but it's still in early days. You're still learning a lot. And then, the technology continues to mature. You start going into the early majority, and that's where, you get the big uptake of many other organizations and individuals who are then taking on that technology, leading to the late majority. Those are the folks who kind of waited for everyone else to implement it before they did, and then the true laggards at the very end. And you really, pretty much most of us don't want to be either on the innovators end or the laggards end. We want to be in the early or the late majority, and probably, the early majority would be where a lot of us should be in this curve. So how do we deal with this both personally and organizationally? This very rapidly changing landscape, our inability to predict very well, things coming in from left field all the time that we didn't imagine. What are some strategies that libraries can take? First of all, I think it's really important for us to work hard to create agile institutions, and this is, of course, very difficult for some of the reasons I've already outlined, including the fact that most of us are public institutions, which are often constricted in various ways. But there may be ways in which we can do things like minimize red tape. I'm a huge fan of using task forces to accomplish work rather than standing committees. Standing committees can be great to just, monitor a certain issue, but in terms of doing actual work, they often suck at it. And part of that reason is standing committees don't always have the right people in the room to actually do the work. So I think standing committees should, by and large, spawn task forces which are given specific goals and then are disbanded when they accomplish those goals. I'm not going to go through all of these. You can read, but these are some of the strategies I think that we need to start taking as libraries to create more agile institutions. Of course, along with this, we need to do things to foster lifelong learning with our staff. And I want to make the real point here that this requires investment. It actually requires dollars and time. So I think all our organizations need to step up to this, realizing that although professionals are expected to learn on their own time, most of our libraries are staffed by paraprofessionals who are not expected to learn on their own time and should be supported in doing that in various ways. And here's a few of the ways in which we can do that. I think it's an ongoing struggle to reimagine our services, and we need to keep looking at this and seeing how we can adjust our services given technologies. So, for example, now most people are walking around with a computer in their pocket, right? So what can we do for those people that might be different than what we've done in the past, where we expect people to walk in physically into our spaces and use our collections? My local public library did something I thought was kind of neat along those lines, and that is they installed picnic tables outside, and they fully expect people to, even when the library is closed, to come sit at those picnic tables and use their Wi-Fi service. So I thought that was an interesting adjustment to how their clientele now are working, how they expect to work. A lot of libraries are focusing on special collections these days because the commodity material is often more widely available. So that's another thing to look at. Anyway, these are just a few things to be thinking about. Realize that there are absolutely no permanent parts. There is pretty much nothing technologically that will be there forever. So this means we need to do things like monitor the environment. And one of the ways I do that is I subscribe to Bloomberg Business Week. And I'm a big fan of reading outside our profession. And one of the things that I find useful is reading a business magazine, because things that are happening in the business world impact libraries. And as I've think I've kind of at least alluded to, it often will impact libraries after it impacts businesses because of some of the reasons I've talked about. So it can be kind of early warning of what's coming down the pike, and that can be useful. Keep in mind that your job will change. I can't begin to tell you how many times my job has changed over the last 20, 30 years. It's professional development, of course, is your own responsibility. You should do it all the time, and it's just part of being a professional. I always try to keep an eye out for what the next big thing is. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to impact libraries, but it's good to monitor it, evaluate it. If you don't think it's going to impact libraries right now, then that's fine. Set it aside, come back and take another look at it later on, and just kind of monitor it and see if it's going to be something that is something you need to pay attention to. If something does seem like something you want to implement in your library, communicate with everyone early and often, and just keep that going, because communication is key. People hate it when things are sprung on them, and for good reason. Also, invite them in, have them really engage in both learning about and shaping how that technology might be implemented within their institution. Keep an eye out for those who might be a champion that you could sign on to help implement a new technology. So, just some strategies then for thinking about and working with implementing new technologies. I think it's vital that we create agile institutions, and we, of course, support our staff in helping to do that. We do need to constantly focus our services on what our end users need and want, and that means, really understanding what they're, where they're coming from and what they're wanting to do, and that can take time and effort to do that. So some final specific advice to go through here, and then we're going to open it up for answering some questions and have your comments. One is, as we looked at the categories of innovativeness, I mentioned probably neither an early adopter nor laggard be, and leave the cutting edge to someone else. Don't adopt the 1.0 technology. Let others kind of shake it out a bit and run it around the block, figure out what it's good for, what it's not good for. Of course, there are exceptions to this, but they tend to come from very large libraries that have the wherewithal to do this kind of technology shakeout. Most of us are going to want to be in that early majority location on that chart. So another thing to keep in mind is technology with market share tends to be better technology. So even if a really good technology comes along, but it solves the same problem as something that already is out there in a major way, it may not be able to unseat it. Now, there are some examples of just the opposite. So again, all these rules are not really rules. They're rules that are broken in various ways. So another thing to consider is do not underestimate the power of an upstart with a great idea. So an example I want to give here is, I don't know how many of you were around when SideQuest is a company that for a while basically owned the market of removable storage. So they had a device that you could attach to your computer that used cartridges. So you'd stick in a cartridge and you'd be able to store a lot of data on that cartridge, and then you could take it out of the device and put another one in. So it was basically unlimited storage. It was only limited by the number of cartridges you bought. And so they basically owned that market for quite a while. And then an upstart came along with what's called the zip drive, and they, within just a few years, they basically destroyed SideQuest. And SideQuest tried to come out with a product that was very similar to the zip drive, but they were too late to market. and this Upstart, as I mentioned, just destroyed them and took over the market because they had a better idea, and people just kind of flocked to that. So, this is a painful lesson to me because I thought that SideQuest would be still able to own the market. So I went with the SideQuest version of the zip drive, and of course they went down in defeat, and I learned my lesson. Always remember that everything we do should be aimed at the end user. Who are we trying to serve? What do they want? How do we give it to them? How do we give them the compelling service that is going to make them come back again and again? Of course, by now we've probably all learned this one. I even just in the last few months had a situation where my computer just up and died. It was fine the night before, and I went back to it sitting on my desk the next morning, and it was completely dead. And I ended up losing about a month's worth of work because my backup had been that old. So, keep that in mind. Just, things happen. Stuff happens, so be always backing things up. This is a pet peeve of mine. I see library directors all the time who do not renew computers frequently enough, and so staff will be using computers which are basically bricks. They're 5 years older or older, and they shouldn't be on them anymore, and yet the administration will not invest the little bit of money it takes to not have their most expensive resource, which is staff, wait on one of the most inexpensive resources, which is hardware. So I always try to tell people to, renew your hardware on a regular basis, and that basically means on a 3-year cycle, because software is always demanding more of hardware all the time. New versions actually will slow you down on an old computer. I'm a huge fan of prototypes. When you're imagining a new kind of service, new kind of computer service, it can be really insightful to put a prototype together and just see what it would look like to do a specific thing. And this doesn't even really have to be a working prototype. It can be wireframes, it can be, but it enables people to envision what you have in mind. And so this can be a really useful way to highlight a new technology or a new capability that you want to consider implementing in your library, but you need to bring others along in understanding what that is and how it might be useful. Of course, hardware changes on a rapid basis. We've seen tremendous change just in the last 10 years in terms of what hardware can do. And so as a general rule, don't buy hardware until the last possible moment. And I phrase it this way because a while back, we're getting grants to do all kinds of digitization projects. And so when you got a lump of money from a granting agency, your first tendency was to go out and buy the hardware. You wanted to get the toys. But in reality, there was usually a lot of upfront work that would have to happen in order to figure out what you're going to digitize, procedures, all the various things you need to put together before you actually start to, slap things onto scanners. So, I was a big proponent of holding off on the actual hardware acquisition until the last possible moment, because every month, hardware gets better and better and better. So just keep that in mind. Of course, never buy the first release of software. It just don't. Software is pushed out there so fast these days that the 1.0 version won't last but maybe a week before there's some bug fix or whatever that comes out. Also, as you can imagine, things move so quickly that just about the time you've learned something completely thoroughly, it's already being replaced by something else. So this is also why, at least in my career, I've always tried to just learn the minimum amount I needed to get the job done. And then when I realized I needed to know more, I'd go back and learn that bit. But I would never learn something so thoroughly that, I knew everything about it. I just learned barely enough to do what I needed to do. And that's really stood me in good stead, because I've gone through, several different programming languages and, a tremendous number of various hardware products and so forth. And so learning something thoroughly just probably isn't really a good idea. Also, I think we imagine that, when we're given a particular thing to accomplish, I think we tend to imagine that there's one perfect way of doing it, when in reality, there's probably several ways that will be successful. And so it's just a matter of finding one of those several ways, and not the perfect way, but the one that works best in your environment. And then, of course, we all know that there's countless ways it could fail. We've certainly, at least I have, run into a number of ways in which failure is easy enough to run into. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. We can now go to some of the questions that you might have. If I think Jamie or Jean will help me in seeing what some of those are, but please do feel free to type in any of your questions or comments at this point, and then we will tackle those.
Yes, thank you so much, Roy. A few things did come in, some questions and comments. And Renee said, with technology being prevalent in mostly everything we do, isn't it up to the library to encourage and try to assist the older population that might be reluctant to learn the technology? Even though you mentioned they might not want to, the library is a place where it can be illustrated how learning would be beneficial. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. Yeah, I would think certainly in a public library situation that would be totally not only really helpful, but I think it's one of the things that libraries could really shine at, to assist actually not just older people, but when you think about it, young people, people who don't have access to certain technologies at home, but may want or need to interact with technologies. So, yeah, I think that's a perfect role for libraries to play in helping, a community to use new technologies that they might find really useful in their lives. Libraries have always been a way for people to get access to expensive things that they can't afford themselves. So I know a lot of libraries, for example, are considering 3D printers, other kinds of services which are expensive for individuals to actually own, but they might want to have access to them. And so I think that's a perfect role. I've often said that, shouldn't say I've often said it, I've recently said that I believe the mission of librarians is to empower. And I can think of nothing more empowering than helping people to learn new technologies and giving them access to those technologies in many cases as well. So, yeah, totally right on.
Great, thank you. Mark asks, does the Gartner hype cycle also apply to software implementation, like a new ILS software?
That's a very good question. It's a nuanced one, and I want to make a distinction between, say, a specific vendor and a particular type of implementation. So, for example, cloud computing is definitely on the Gartner hype cycle. However, and there are many ILS systems, including OCLCs, that is based on cloud computing concepts and technologies. So in that sense, yes. But if you're talking about a particular vendor's product, I don't see that as being necessarily going through the same kind of hype cycle. It might. Like if you think, let's say you're with a particular vendor like Xlibris, and Xlibris rolls out their new system, Alma, whatever. Maybe people get super excited about it, and then they kind of know more about it and they go through that disillusionment, and then they realize, it is really useful, but maybe not as completely useful as they thought. You might end up going through that on kind of an individual basis, but I don't see it really happening kind of on a market-wide basis. It's more like the underlying technologies that we may be using in ILS systems.
Great, thank you. I got two questions from Chris, and I think they kind of go hand in hand. She asks, any ideas on what might be the next big thing for libraries, and do you ever see smartphones and pad devices replacing PCs?
Oh, good question. Good couple questions. Okay, I was afraid I'd get the next big thing question because
yeah.
it's inevitable, it's understandable, and yet it's so difficult. And it's so difficult because, well, for one, it depends on where you're coming from. The next big thing for public libraries may not be the next big thing for academic libraries. So it's tricky. However, having said that, again, kind of going, one of the things that I've been eyeing, that I've been looking at, that I've been trying to follow is something that I and others have called the maker revolution. And that's, the concept that, we've gone through this period, if you will, of being absolute consumers. So if we want something, we just go and buy it. But there's been this really a movement really to take that control back a bit from those who manufacture things and put it back in the hands of individuals and creative individuals. And I think that's a very interesting trend, and one that particularly public libraries, but also increasingly academic libraries, are engaging with. So I think that's potentially really a next big thing, especially if you live in a community that has a lot of people who are going that way. So here in California, I can tell you it's huge. We have the Maker Faire, probably, well, the largest Maker Faire probably in the world, and no doubt the first one as well, because O'Reilly and Associates, who are out here in Sonoma County where I live, has really taken on that culture and really fostered it. So that might be one thing I can throw out there in terms of the next big thing. The other, do I see phones and pad devices replacing computers? I really don't, and I say this because I've been using a smartphone, a pad device, and my laptop now for probably at least 3 years in tandem. And I find that each device has its niche. So I do some things, I turn to the smartphone to do some things, I turn to the iPad to do some things, I turn to my laptop to do some things, and I find that no single device is good at them all. And in fact, it infuriates my daughter, one of my daughters, 21, and she thinks that it's over-consumerism, that the fact that I've got 3 devices that are so similar. And I understand her point. But to me, especially a technology geek, I mean, I see the benefits of each of those. Like, although it's possible to type on my iPad, I just find any kind of typing thing to be much easier on my laptop. So I do all of that there. There's even nuances in apps. So I find myself turning to my phone to do certain things that I find more difficult to do on my pad, which in strange ways. So I really don't think that they're going to replace computers. Now, the one question I might have is, will laptops replace desktops? And there I think it's much more likely. The only reason why I would see a desktop being more useful than a laptop is in really high-end processing jobs. So things like doing digital video and things like that, where you really need the computing power, and that's where desktop computers shine. But in terms of just regular work, like if you're doing Microsoft Office, and there's absolutely no reason why you can't be on a laptop. And the benefit of a laptop is it can go with you everywhere. So I really think that we're probably really seeing a decrease, at least, in terms of desktops, particularly in the professions. So if you're a professional where you may be expected to take your work home with you, a laptop is the only way to go. If you're basically just a minion who comes in and only does work on a computer at work, then that's where a desktop probably makes, sense. But I really don't see the mobile devices killing the computer.
Okay, great, thank you. So John asks, you mentioned having a 3-year plan, but then buying hardware at the last minute if you can. So how do you balance that out?
Yeah, I know, it's a good question. You guys are good. Well, that's always been the struggle. And usually what I try to do is there's actually websites out there that will track this. So I happen to be a Mac user, but I'm sure there's, ways you can do this in the PC world. But they will actually predict when the next revolution of the technology, when the next version of a piece of hardware is going to come out. So, 3 years is kind of a general rule, but what you can do is you can go out and you can take a look and see that if you're in the market for, let's say you're in the market for a MacBook Pro or something, you can go to that website and see if you should wait. And often the wait is not that long. It might be a few months, maybe 6 months. But if it gets much beyond that, you should just go ahead and do it, at least in my estimation, because at some point you just have to jump in. And one factor would be how painful it is with what you have now. And I can tell you, after having just gone through this computer crash, my computer was really only about 2 years old, and I saw a tremendous improvement. And partly why I think I saw that tremendous improvement is because my new computer uses a solid-state drive rather than a spinning disk. And so that has really boosted the performance in a way that is really kind of astonishing. So, those kinds of things I think are good to keep in mind as well, that when there is a change in underlying technology, there may be some additional improvements in the ability of the hardware.
Great, thank you. Nanette mentions, I served on a board for a public library, and the trustees and others had fears about diving into social media. I couldn't convince them to even have a Facebook page or a Twitter account. They were concerned about liability. So what are some of the greatest threats right now to libraries using social media? Wow,
that's interesting. I hadn't thought of liability, which is interesting. Well, okay, when I'm faced with a situation like that, usually what I do is I look around. I try to find people who are doing what I want to do. So I would look around and see other boards that I could find who are using social media, and I would talk to them. And I would get some, if you will, testimonials from them about how they find, and well, I'm assuming they would find it useful in some way. If they don't, then finally maybe you just need to move on. But if they do find it useful and helpful, then they may be able to tell you how and why. And just having examples like that of saying, well, look, here's this board over here that's doing it, and this is their experience, I think can be very powerful in terms of persuading your board of the benefits of doing that. But without that evidence, then I think it would be very hard to refute their reluctance. So I would really try to go out and find some situations where it really has been helpful, especially if they can give you lessons learned and things to do and things to avoid, which might allay some of their fears, and specifically their fear of liability. If you can ask some boards who have done it successfully, ask them about that issue and how they've approached that. And there may be a way, such a thing, there could be something to be done with the insurance or whatever, I don't know, but a way to indemnify people on social media. I'm not sure that there is, but that might be something to look at.
Great, thank you. Carolyn asks, I wonder if Roy might comment on open source software, especially ILSs, related to the cycle and the ability to stay current.
Yeah, interesting. Well, first of all, I'm a fan of open source. I've been involved in open source software projects since the early mid-'90s, and I see the benefits of open source, but not all open source software solutions are the same. So it's hard to do a broad brush on, for example, ILS software. So you probably need to talk about specific, Evergreen, Koha. You probably have to talk about those specific environments. And I don't know enough about them to be able to talk intelligently about them. But one of the things I would say about it is that, if you have development resources where you actually have people who can program, then open source software can then enable you to have control over your own enhancements. So, if you want the software to be able to do a certain thing, you can actually go out and just program it yourself. But if you don't have programming resources, then you're at the beck and call of everyone else, just like if you're buying software from a commercial vendor. So it can be very enabling, but for many libraries it isn't, because you still then have to advocate, within a user group or whatever for your own enhancements that you wish to make.
Great, thank you.
So it really kind of depends on your your institutional environment.
All right. We have time for one more question, and that is, do you think public libraries should have mobile technology to encourage librarians to get out from behind the desk and roam in the library and out in the community?
Oh, totally. Totally. I really believe that, especially, in the public library sphere, we need to be as professionals, we need to be out there among the people we're serving in all kinds of ways. And, another thing I'm a fan of, which I didn't mention specifically, but we need to be using the technologies our users are using. And if we don't have librarians with pad devices and smartphones, then we're done. We can't serve those people because we have no clue what their world is like. We have to know what their world is like in order to serve them. So I think it's very important that librarians be just as connected as their users. Now, having said that, I think it's also important to not lose sight of the fact that many of our users, in fact, many of our core users in the public library sphere, don't have those devices, don't have access to them necessarily, come from poor households which can't afford the monthly internet bill. Those kinds of situations are still there. So we need to fully keep our eyes on that, as well as understanding where many of our users are now coming from, where they want to have things delivered to them on their pad device or on their iPhone or whatever. So I think that's important. It's also important that we be out and among our users, both in our buildings and outside of our buildings. So yeah, totally agree.
Great. Roy, in about 20 seconds, can you talk a little bit about what you find most exciting in libraries right now? I'm asking this of all of our presenters, and it's interesting hearing the different responses. So what do you see as being exciting right now in libraries?
Well, actually, what excites me the most right now in libraries is seeing the young professionals come in and their new perspectives and what they bring to the table. I'm just so happy with what I see out there in terms of the new talent. I'll probably retire in less than 10 years, and I'm going to go into that dark night just so thrilled with where we're headed, because I just see so much talent out there.
Awesome.
Great.
Just want to remind all of you that Roy's slides are actually posted already to our site. The recording should be made available later today. Our next session is at 1 o'clock with Daniel Rasmus, Listening to the Future of Libraries. I want to thank Roy for an excellent presentation, lots of good food for thought. I want to thank all of you for listening in, for your questions, for your comments. I hope to see you again for another session. If not, thank you for participating in this one. Have a great rest of your afternoon. So long.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Appreciate it.